Part 4 of A Portrait of a Man with Red Hair by Hugh Walpole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4, The Tower, Section 2. 4. "And so the curtain falls on Act 3 of this pleasant little drama," said Dunbar huskily, turning towards the window. "There will be a 20 minutes interval, but the last act will be played in camera. If only one wasn't so beastly tired, and if only it wasn't all my fault." His voice broke. Harkness went up to him, put his arm around him, and drew him to him. "Look here, I'm older than both of you. I might almost be your father, so you've got to obey my orders. I'll be best man at your wedding yet, David, yours and Hester's. There's nobody to blame. Nothing but the fog. But don't let's cheat ourselves either. We're shut up here at 5:30 in the morning, miles from any help, no way out, no telephone, and two damn Japs who are stronger than we are, in the power of a man who's as mad as a hatter and as bloodthirsty as a tiger. It's going to be all right, I tell you. I know it. I feel it in my bones. But we've got to behave for these 20 minutes, only 17 of them now, as though it won't be. It's of no use for us to make any plan. We'll have to do something on the spur of the moment when we see what the old devil has up his sleeve for us. Meanwhile, as I say, make the best of these minutes." He put out his arm and drew Hester in. "I tell you that I love you both. I've only known you a day, but I love you as I've never loved anyone in my life before. I love you as father and brother and comrade. It's the best thing that has happened to me in all my life." The three, body to body, stood looking out through the gilded bars at the sky, silver gray and washed with shifting shadows. "After all," he went on, "if our luck doesn't hold and we are going to die in the next hour or so, what is it? It's only what millions of fellows passed through in the war, and under much more terrible conditions. Imagination is the worst part of that fancy, and I suggest that we don't think of what is going to happen when this time is over, whether it goes well or ill. We'll fill these 20 minutes with every decent thought we've got. We'll think of every fine thing that we know of, and every beautiful thing, and everything that is of good report." "All I pray," said Dunbar, "is that I may have one last dash at that lunatic before good-bye. He can have 100 Japs around him, but I'll get at him somehow. Harkness, you're a brick. I brought you into this. I had no right to, but I'm not going to apologize. We're here, the thing's done, and if it hadn't been for that rotten fog— But you're right, Harkness. We'll think of all the ripping things we know. With me it's simple enough, because the beginning and the middle and the end of it is Hester. Hester first, and Hester second, and Hester all the time." He didn't look at her, but stared out of the window. "By Jove, the sun's coming. It's been up round the corner ever so long. It will just about hit the window in another 10 minutes. It seems kind of stupid to stand here doing nothing." He stepped forward and felt the bars. "Take hours to get through that, and then there's a drop of hundreds of feet. No, you're about right, Harkness. There's nothing to be done here but say good-bye as decently as possible." He sighed. "I didn't want to kick the bucket just yet, but there it is. It can happen to anybody. A fellow can be as strong as a horse, forget to change his socks, and next day be finished. This is better than pneumonia, anyway. All the same, I can't help feeling we missed our chance just now when we had him alone in here." "No," said Harkness, "I was watching him. That's what he wanted, for us to go for him. I am sure that he had the Japs handy somewhere, and I think he wanted to hurt us in front of Hester. But his brain works queerly. He's formulated a kind of book of rules for himself. If we take such and such a step, then he will take such and such another. A sort of insane sense of justice. He's worked it all out to the minute. Half the fun for him has been the planning of it, and then the deliberate slowness of it, watching us, calculating what we'll do. Really, a cat with mice. There's nothing for deliberate consecutive thinking like a madman's brain." Hester broke in. "We're wasting time. I know, I feel as you do, that it's going to be all right, but however he fails with you, he can carry me off somewhere, and so it is very likely that I don't see either of you again for some time. But if that's so, I just want to say that you've been the finest men in the world to me. And I want you to know that whatever turns up for me now, yes, whatever it is, it can't be as bad as it was before yesterday. I can't ever again be as unhappy as I was, now that I've known both of you, as I've known you this night. I didn't realize, David, how I felt about you until Mr. Harkness showed me. I've been so selfish all these years, and I suppose I shall go on being selfish, because one doesn't change all in a minute, but at least I've got the two best friends a woman's ever had." "Hester," Dunbar said, turning towards her, "if we get free of this, and you can get rid of that man, I ask you, as I've asked you every week for the last 10 years, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. But for the moment she turned to Harkness. He was looking through the bars out to the sky, where the mist was now very faintly rose, like the colored smoke of far distant fire. She put her hand on his shoulder, keeping her other hand on Dunbar's. "I don't know why you said you were so much older than we are. You're not. Do you promise to be the friend of both of us always?" "Yes," he said. Something mockingly repeated in his brain, "It is a far, far better thing I do." He burst out laughing. The Macabre awoke, put up his head, and screamed. "You are both younger by centuries than I," he said. "I was born old. I was born with the old man of Europe singing in my ears. I was born to the inheritance of borrowed culture. The gifts that the fairies gave me at my cradle were Michelangelo's David, Rembrandt's Goldweyer's Field, the temples at Paestum, the Da Vinci Last Supper, the Bruegels at Vienna, the view of the Jungfrau from Meulan, the Grand Canal at dawn, Hogarth's Prince, and the quintet of the Meistersinger. Yes, the gifts were piled up all right, but just as they were all showered upon me, in stepped the wicked fairy, and said that I should have them all, on condition that I did not touch. Never touch, never. At least I've known that they were there, at least I've bent the knee, but until last night. He suddenly took Hester's face between his two hands, kissed her on the forehead, on the eyes, on the mouth. "I don't know what's coming in a quarter of an hour. I don't like to think. To tell you the truth, I'm in the devil of a funk. But I love you, I love you, I love you. Like an uncle, you know, or at least like a brother. You've taken a match and set fire to this old tinder box that's been dry and dusty so long, and now it's alight. Such a pretty blaze." He broke away from them both with a smile that suddenly made him look young as they'd never seen him. "I've danced the town, I've climbed the rocks, I've dared the devil, I've fallen in love, and I know at last that there's such a hunger for beauty in my soul that it must go on and on and on. Why should it be there? My parents hadn't it, my sisters haven't it, no one tried to give it to me. I've done nothing with it until last night. But now, when I've needed it, it's come to my help. I've touched life at last. I'm alive. I never can die any more." The Macabre screamed again and again, beating at the cage with its wings. "Hester, never lose courage. Remember that he can't touch you, that no one can touch you. You're your own immortal mistress." The red-lacquered clock struck the quarter, and at the same moment the sun hit the window. Strange to see how instantly that room with the colored pagodas, the fantastic temples, the gilt chairs, and the purple carpet shivered into tinsel. The dust floated on the ladder of the sun. The blue of the early morning sky was colored faintly like a bird's wing. The sun flooded the room, wrapping them all in its mantle. "Let's sit down," said Dunbar, pulling 3 of the gilt chairs into the center of the room, where the sun shone brightest. "I've a kind of idea that we'll need all the strength we've got in a few minutes. That's fine, what you said, Harkness, about being alive, although I didn't follow you altogether. I'm not very artistic. A man who's been on the sea since he was a small kid doesn't go to many picture galleries, and he doesn't read books much either. To tell you the truth, there's always such a lot to do, and when I finish the Daily Mail, there doesn't seem time for much more, except a shocker sometimes. The sort of mess we're in now wouldn't make a bad shocker, would it? Only you'd never be able to make Crispin convincing. All I know is, if I wrote a book about him, I'd have him tortured at the end with little red devils and plenty of pincers. However, I get what you mean, Harkness, about being alive. I felt something of the same thing in the war sometimes. At Jutland, although I was in the devil of a funk all the time. I was sort of pleased with myself, too. Life's always seemed a bit unreal since the armistice, until last night. And it's a funny thing, but when I was helping Hester climb out of that window and expecting Crispin Jr. to poke his head up at any minute, I had just that same pleased all-over feeling that I had at Jutland. So that's about the same as you feel, Harkness, only different, of course, because of your education. Hester, if we win out of this and you marry me, I'll be so good to you that— He beat his hands desperately on his knees. "Here's the time slipping, and we don't seem to be doing anything with it. It's always been my trouble that I've never been able to say what I mean. Couldn't find words, you know. I can't now, but it's simple enough what I mean." Hester said, "If we only have 10 minutes like this, it's so hard to choose what you would say. But I'd like you to know, David, that I remember everything we've ever done together. The time I missed the train at Truro, and was so frightened about Father, and you said you'd come in with me, and Father hadn't even noticed I'd been away. And the time you brought me the pink fan from Madrid, and the time I had that fever, and you sat up all night outside my room. Those 2 days Father was away. And the day Billy fell over the Bring Rock and you climbed down after him, and the time you brought me that psyllium and Father wouldn't let me have him, and the time just before you went off to South Africa and I wouldn't say good-bye. I've hurt you so many times, and you've never been angry with me once, or only that once. Do you remember the day I struck you in the face because you said I was more like a boy than a girl? I thought you were laughing at me, because I was so untidy and dirty, and so I hit you. And do you remember, you sprang on me like a tiger, and for a moment I thought you were going to kill me. You said no one had ever struck you without getting it back. Then suddenly you pulled yourself in, just like going inside and shutting your door. I've never seen you until tonight, David. I've been blind to you. You've been too close to me for me to see you. It will be all right. We'll come out of this, and then we'll have such times, such wonderful times." She came up to him, drew his head to her breast. He knelt on the floor at her feet, his arms round her, his head on her bosom. She stroked his hair, looking out beyond him to the blue of the sky. Harkness felt a mad wildness of impatience. He went to the window and tugged at the bars. In despair, his hands fell to his side. "The only chance, Dunbar, is to go straight for him the moment we're out of this room, even if those damned Japs are with him. We can't do much, but we may smash him up a bit first. Then there's Jabez. We've forgotten Jabez. Where's he been all this time?" Dunbar looked up. "I expect he went home after we went off." "No," said Harkness. "He was to be there till 6. He told me. What's happened to him? At any rate, he'll give the alarm if we don't turn up." "No, he'll think we got safely off." "Yes, I suppose he will. My God, it's 5 to 6. Look here, stand up a moment." They stood up. "Let's take hands. Let's swear this. Whatever happens to us now, whether some of us survive or none, whether we die now or live happily ever afterwards, we'll be friends forever. Nothing shall ever separate us, for better or worse, we're together for always." They swore it. "And see here, if I don't come out of this, don't have any regrets, either of you. Don't think you brought me into this against my will. Don't think that, whichever way it goes, I regret a moment of it. You've given me the finest time." Dunbar laughed. "I sort of feel we're going to have a chance yet. After all, he's been probably playing with us, trying to frighten us. There'll be nothing in it, you see. Anyway, I'll get a crack at his skull, and now that I've got you, Hester, I won't give up this night for all the wealth of the Indies. I don't know about life or death. I've never thought much about it, to tell you the honest truth, but I bet that anyone who's as fond of anyone as I am of you can't be very far away, whatever happens to their body. There goes 6. The red lacquer clock struck. Hester flung her arms around Harkness and kissed him, then Dunbar. They all stood listening. Just as the clock ceased, there was a knock at the door. 5. Harkness went to the door and opened it. Not Crispin, as he had expected, but one of the Japanese. For the first time he spoke. "Beg your pardon, sir. The master would be glad to see him upstairs." Harkness did not look back. He knew that Dunbar and Hester were clasped tightly in one another's arms. He walked out, closing the door behind him. He stood with the Japanese in the small space, waiting. It was a dim, subdued light out here. You could only see the thick stone steps of the circular staircase winding upwards out of sight. Harkness's brain was working now with feverish activity. Whatever Crispin's devilish plan might be, he would be there to watch the climax of it. If Harkness and Dunbar were quick enough, they could surely have Crispin throttled before the Japanese were in time. Without Crispin, it was likely enough that the Japanese would be passive. This was no affair of theirs. They simply obeyed their master's orders. He wondered why he had not attempted something in that room just now, why, indeed, he had prevented Dunbar. But some instinct had told him then that Crispin was longing to shame them in some way before Hester. He had then an almost overpowering impulse to turn back, run into that room, fling his arms about Hester, and hold her until those devils pulled them apart. It was an impulse that rose blinding his eyes, deafening his ears, stunning his brain. He half turned. The door opened, and Dunbar came out. Harkness sighed with relief. At the sight of Dunbar, the temptation left him. They mounted the stairs, one Japanese in front of them, the other behind. At the next break in the flight, the Japanese turned and opened a door on the left. "In here, gentlemen, if you please," he said, bowing. They entered a small room with no windows, quite dark save for one dim electric light in the ceiling, and without furniture save for 2 wicker chairs. They stood there, waiting. "The master," said the Japanese. "He much obliged if you gentlemen will kindly take your clothes off." For a moment there was silence. They had not realized the words. Then Dunbar broke out, "No, by God, no! Strip for that swine? Harkness, come on, you go for that fellow. I'll take this one." And instantly he had hurled himself on the Japanese nearest the door. Harkness flung at the one who had spoken. He was conscious of his fingers clutching at the thin cotton stuff of the clothes, and beneath the clothes the cold, hard steel of the limbs. His arms gripped upwards, caught the cloth of the shirt, tore it, slipped on the smooth, hairless chest. Then in his left forearm there was a pain, sharp as though some ravenous animal had bitten him there, then an agony in the middle of his back, then in his left thigh. Against his will he cried out. The pain was terrible, awful. Every nerve in his body was rebelling, so that he had neither strength nor force. He slipped to the floor, writhing involuntarily with the agony of the twisted muscle, and even as he slipped, he saw sliding down over him, impervious, motionless, fixed like a shining mask, the face of the Japanese. He lay on the floor. Panic flooded him. His helplessness, the terror of what was coming next, the fright of the dark, it was all he could do at that moment not to burst into tears and cry like a child. He was lying on the floor, and the Japanese, kneeling beside him, had one arm under him as though to make his position more comfortable. "Very sorry," the Japanese murmured in his ear. "The master's orders." As the pain withdrew, he felt only an intense relief and thankfulness. He did not care about what had gone before, nor mind what followed. All he wished was to be left like that until the wild beating of his heart softened and his pulse was again tranquil. Then he thought of Dunbar. He turned his head and saw that Dunbar also was lying on the floor, on his side. Not a sound came from him. The other Japanese was bending over him. "Dunbar!" Harkness cried in a voice that, to his own surprise, was only a whisper. "Wait! It's no good with these fellows. We'll have our chance later." Dunbar replied, the words gritted from between his teeth. "No, it's no good with these devils. It's all right, though. I'm cheery." Harkness saw then that the Japanese had been stripping Dunbar, and he noticed with a curious little wonder that his clothes had been arranged in a neat, tidy pile, his socks, his collar, his braces, on his shirt and trousers. He saw the Japanese move forward as though to help Dunbar to his feet. There was a movement as though Dunbar were pushing him away. He rose to his feet, naked, strong, his head up, swung out his arms, pushed out his chest. "No bones broken with their monkey tricks. Hurry up, Harkness. We may as well go into the sea together. I bet the water's cold." But no. The Japanese said something. Dunbar broke out, "I'm damned if I will." Then, turning to Harkness, "He says I've got to go on by myself. It seems they're going to separate us. Rotten luck, but there's no fighting these two fellows here. Well, cheerio, Harkness. You've been a mighty fine pal. If we don't meet again. Only that rotten fog did us in." Harkness struggled to his knees. No, Dunbar. They shan't separate us. They shan't." But there was a touch of a hand on his arm, and instantly, as though to save at all costs another pressure of that nerve, he sank back. Dunbar went out, one of the Japanese following him. The door closed. Now indeed Harkness needed all his fortitude. He had never felt such loneliness as this. From the beginning of the adventure there had been an element so fantastic, so improbable, that except at certain moments he had never believed in the final reality of it. There was something laughable, ludicrous about Crispin himself. He had been like a child playing with his toys. Now, absolutely, Harkness was face to face with reality. Crispin did mean all that he had threatened, and what that might be. The Japanese was beginning to take off his clothes, very lightly and gently pulling his coat from under him. Harkness sat up and assisted him. This did not matter. Of what significance was it whether he had clothes or not? What mattered was that he should be out of this horrible room where there was neither space nor light nor company. Anything, anywhere, was better. The Japanese's cool, hard fingers slipped about his body. He himself undid his collar, and mechanically dropped his collar stud into the right-hand pocket of his waistcoat, where he always put it when he was undressing. He bent forward and took off his shoes. The Japanese gravely thanked him. There was a small hole in his right sock, and he slipped it off quickly, covering it with his other hand. He was ashamed for the Japanese to see it. His clothes were piled as neatly as Dunbar's. He stood up, feeling freshened and cool. Then the Japanese, bowing, moved to the door. Harkness followed him. They climbed the stairs once more, the stone striking cold under Harkness's bare feet. They must now be reaching the very top of the tower. There was a sense of space and height about them, and a stronger light. The Japanese paused, pushed back a door, and sharply jerked Harkness forward. Harkness nearly fell, but was caught by someone else, closed his eyes involuntarily against a flood of light into which he seemed, with a curious sensation as though he had dived from a great height, to be sinking ever deeper and deeper, then to be struggling up through bursting bubbles of color. His eyes were still closed against the sun that pressed like a warm palm upon the lids. He felt hands moving about him, then that he was held back against something cold, then that he was being bound, gently, smoothly. The bands did not hurt his flesh. There was a pause. He still kept his eyes closed. Was this death, then? The sun beat upon his body, warm and strong. The cool of the pillar to which he was bound was pleasant against his back. There were boards beneath his feet, and on their dry, friendly surface his toes curled. A delicious, soft lethargy wrapped him round. Was this death? One sharp pang, like the pressure of an aching tooth, and then nothing, sinking into dark silence through this shaft of deep and burning sunlight. He opened his eyes. He cried aloud with astonishment. He was in what was plainly the top room of the tower, a high white place with a round ceiling softly primrose. One high window went the length from floor to ceiling, and this window, which was without bars, blazed with sun and shone with the colors of the early morning blue. The room was white, pure virgin white, round and bare of furniture. Only, and this was what had caught the cry from Harkness, 3 pillars supported the ceiling, and to these 3 pillars were bound by white cord, first himself, then Dunbar, then, naked as they, Jabez. The fisherman stood there facing Harkness, a gigantic figure. Yesterday afternoon on the hill, last night in the garden, Harkness had not recognized the man's huge proportions under his clothes. Now, bound there, with his black hair and beard, his great chest, the muscle of his arms and thighs, the sunlight bathing him, he was mighty to see. His eyes were mild and puzzled, like the eyes of a dog who has been chained against reason. He was making a strange, restless motion from side to side, as though he were testing the white cords that held him. His face above his beard, his neck, the upper part of his chest, his hands, his legs beneath the knees, were a deep russet brown. The rest of him a fair white, striking strangely with the jet blackness of his hair. He smiled as he saw Harkness's astonishment. "Aye, sir," he said, "it wasn't me you was expectin' to see here, and it wasn't myself that was expectin' to be here, either." They were alone. No Japanese, no Crispin. "I've been in here half an hour before you come," he went on, "and I can tell you, sir, I was mighty sorry to see them bring 'em both you gentlemen in. Whatever happens to me, I said, they've got clear away. It never kind of struck me that the fog was going to worry you." "Why didn't you get away yourself, Jabez?" Harkness asked him. "They was down on me about an hour after. The fog had come on pretty thick, and I was walking up and down out there thinking. I hadn't no more than another hour of it, and pleasing myself to think how mad that old devil would be when he'd found out what had happened, and me safe in my own house with the mother, when all of a sudden I hear the car snorting. 'Something's up,' I says, and 3 seconds later, as you might say, they was on me. If I hadn't been for that fog, I might have got clear, but they was on me before I knew it. I had a bit of a struggle with they dirty stinking foreigners, but they got a lot of dirty tricks an Englishman would be ashamed of using. Anyway, they had me down on the ground pretty quick, and hurt me, too. They trussed me up like a fowl, carried me into the hall, and didn't the old red-headed devil spit and curse? You've never seen nothing like it, sir. Sure raving mad he was that time, all right, and he came and kicked me on the face, pulled my beard, and spat in my eyes. I don't know what's coming to us right now, but I pray the Almighty Father to give us just one turn with my fist. I'll land him. Then, sir, they carried me upstairs and tumbled me into a dark room. There I was, for I wouldn't like to say how long. Then they came in, took my things off of me, the dirty foreigners. It's only a foreigner would think of a thing like that. I struggled a bit, but what's the use? They put their thumbs on your back, and they've got you. Then they tied me up here. I had to laugh, I did, really. Did you ever see such a comic picture as all three of us, without a stitch between us, tied up here at 6 in the morning? When I tell Mother about it, she'll laugh all right, like the show down to St. Ives when they have the boxing. I suppose we'll be getting out of this all serene, sir, won't we? Of course we will, said Dunbar. Don't you worry, Jabez. He's been doing all this to frighten us. He daren't touch us, really. Why, he'll have the county about his ears as it is. Don't you worry. Thank you, sir, said Jabez, still moving from side to side within the bands. Because, you see, sir, I wouldn't like anything to happen to me just now. Mother's expecting an addition to the family in a month or so, and there's 6 of 'em already, and it needs a bit of doing, looking after them all. I wouldn't have been working for this dirty blackguard here if it hadn't been for there being so many of us. Not that I'd have one of them away, if you understand me, sir. You needn't be afraid, Jabez, Dunbar said. When we get out of this, Mr. Harkness and I will see that you never have any anxiety again. You've been a wonderful friend to us tonight, and we're not likely to forget it. Oh, don't you mistake me, sir, said Jabez. It wasn't no help I was asking for. I'm doing very well with the boat and the potatoes. It was only I was thinking I wouldn't like nothing exactly to happen to me along of this crazy lunatic here, if you understand me, sir. I'm not sure, if they give me time, I couldn't get through these bits of rope here. I'm pretty strong in the arm, or used to be, not so dusty even now. If I could work at them a bit. The door opened, and Crispin came in. He appeared to Harkness as he stepped in, quietly closing the door behind him, like some strange creature of a dream. He seemed himself, in the way that he moved with his eyes nearly closed, somnambulistic. He was wearing now only his white silk pajamas, and of these the sleeves were rolled up, showing his fat white arms. His red hair stood on end like an ill-fitting wig. In one hand he carried a curved knife, with a handle of worked gold. In the room, blazing with sunlight, he was like a creature straight from the boards of some neighboring theatre, even to the white powder that lay in dry flakes upon his face. He opened his eyes, staring at the sunlight, and in their depths Harkness saw the strangest mingling of terror, pathos, eager lust, and a bewildered amazement, as though he were tranced. The gaze with which he turned to Harkness had in it a sudden appeal. Then that appeal sank like light quenched by water. He was rung up on the instant to intense excitement. His whole body trembled. His mouth opened as though he would speak, then closed again. He came close to Harkness. He put out his hand and touched his neck. "We are alone," he said, in his soft, beautiful voice. He stroked Harkness's neck. The soft, boneless fingers! Harkness looked at him, and, strangely, at that moment their eyes were very close to one another. They looked at one another gently. In Harkness's eyes were no malice. In Crispin's, that strange mingling of lust and unhappiness. Harkness only said, "Crispin, whatever you do to us, leave that girl alone. I beg you, leave her." He closed his eyes then. God helping him, he would not speak another word. But a triumphant exultation surged through him, because he knew that he was not afraid. There was no fear in him. It was as though the warm sun beating on his body gave him courage. Standing behind the safeguard of his closed eyes, his real soul seemed to slip away, to run down the circular staircase into the hall and pass happily into the garden, down the road to the sea. His soul was free, and Crispin's was imprisoned. He heard Crispin's voice. "Will you admit now that I have you in my hand? If I touch you here, how you will bleed. Bleed to death, if I do not prevent it. Do you remember Shylock and his pound of flesh? Oh, upright judge! But there is no judge here to stay me." The knife touched him. He felt it as though it had been a wasp's sting. A small cut it must be. And suddenly there was the cool trickle of blood down his skin. Then his right shoulder, a prick. Now a cut again on his arm. Stings, nothing more. But the end had really come then, at last? His hands beneath the bonds moved suddenly of their own impulse. It was not natural not to strive to be free, to fight for his life. He opened his eyes. He was bleeding from 5 or 6 little cuts. Crispin was standing away from him. He saw that Dunbar, crimson in the face, was struggling frantically with his cords, and was shouting. Jabez, too, was calling out. The room, hitherto so quiet, was alive with movement. Crispin now stood back from him, watching him. The sight of blood had completed what these weeks had been preparing. With that first touch of the knife on Harkness's body, Crispin's soul had died. The battle was over. There was an animal here, clothed fantastically, in human clothes like a monkey or a dog at a music-hall show. The animal capered, stood on its hind legs, mowed in the air with its hands. It crept up to Harkness and, whining like a dog, pricked him with the knife point now here, now there, in 100 places. Harkness looked out once more at the great window with its splash of glorious sky, then ceased to struggle with his cords. His lips moved in some prayer, perhaps, and once more, surely now for the last time, he closed his eyes. He had a strange vision of all the moving world beyond that window. At that moment, at the hotel, the maids would be sweeping the corridors, people would be stirring and rubbing their eyes and looking at their watches. In the town, family breakfasts would be preparing. Men would be sauntering down the narrow streets to their work. The connection with the London trains would be running in with the London papers. Already the men and women would be in the fields. The women would be waiting, perhaps, for the fishing fleet to come in. Mrs. Jabez would be at the cottage door, looking up the road for her husband. His heart pounded into his mouth. With a mighty impulse he drove it back. Crispin was laughing. The knife was raised. His face was wrinkled. He was running round the room, round and round, making with the knife strange movements in the air. He was whispering to himself. Round and round and round he ran, words pouring from his mouth in a thick, unending stream. They were not words, they were sounds, and once and again a strange sigh like a catch of the breath, like a choke in the throat. He ran, bending, not looking at the 3 men, bending low, as though, as he ran, he were looking for something on the floor. Then, quite suddenly, he straightened himself, and with a growl and a snarl, the knife raised in one hand, hurled himself at Jabez. All followed then quickly. The knife flashed in the sunlight. It seemed that the hands caught at Jabez's eyes, first one and then another. But there had been more than the hands, because suddenly blood poured from those eyes, spouting over, covering the face, mingling with the beard. With a great cry Jabez put forth his strength. Stung by agony to a power that he had never known until then, his body seemed to rise from the ground, to become something superhuman, immortal. The great head towered, the limbs spread out. It seemed for a moment as though the pillar itself would fall. The cord that tied him to the pillar snapped, and his hands were free. He tottered, the blood pouring from his face. He moved blindly, staggering. Not a sound had come from him since that first cry. His hands flung out, and in another moment Crispin was caught into his arms. He raised him. The little fat hands fluttered, the knife flashed loosely and fell to the ground. The giant swung into the middle of the room, blinded, but holding to himself ever tighter and ever tighter the short, fat body. Crispin, his head tossed back, his legs flung out in an agony now of terror, screamed with a strange, shrill cry like a rabbit entrapped. Jabez turned, and now he had Crispin's soft chest against his bleeding face, the arms fluttering above his head. As he turned, his shoulder touched the glass of the window. He pushed backward with his arm, and the window swung open, some of the broken glass tinkling to the ground. There was a great rush of air. That strange thing, like no human body, the white silk, the brown slippers, the red hair, swung. For 1 second of a time, suspended, as it were, on the thread of that long animal scream, so shrill and yet so thin and distant, the white face, its still eyes staring, the painted mouth open, hung towards Harkness. Then into the air, like a colored bundle of worthless junk. For a moment a dark shadow across the steeple of sunlight, and then down, down, into fathomless depths of air, leaving the space of sky stainless, the morning blue without taint. Jabez stood for a moment facing them, his chest heaving in convulsive pants, then crying, "My eyes!" crumpled to the floor. 6. First, Harkness was conscious of a wonderful silence. Then into the silence, borne in on the back of the sea breeze, he heard the wild chattering of a multitude of birds. The room was filled with their chatter, up from the trees, crowding the room with their life. Straight past the window, like an arrow shot from a bow, flashed a seagull. Then another, more slowly wheeled down, curving against the blue like a wave released into air. He recognized all these things, and then once again that wonderful, blessed stillness. All was peace, all repose. He might rest forever. After, it seemed, an infinity of time, and from a vast distance, he caught Dunbar's voice. "Jabez, Jabez, Jabez, old fellow! The man's fainted. Harkness, are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "No," Harkness quietly answered. "He didn't hurt me. He meant to, though." Then a green curtain of dark, thick cloth swept through the heaven and caught him into its folds. He knew nothing more. The last thing he heard was the glorious, happy chattering of the birds. 7. He slowly climbed an infinity of stairs, up and up and up. The stairs were hard to climb, but he knew that at their summit there would be a glorious view, and for that view he would undergo any hardship. But oh, he was tired, desperately tired. He could hardly raise one foot above another. He had been walking with his eyes closed, because it was cooler that way. Then a bee stung him, then another, on the chest, now on the arm, now a whole flight. He cried out. He opened his eyes. He was lying on a bed. People were about him. He had been climbing those stairs naked. It would never do that those strangers should see him. He must speak of it. His hand touched cloth. He was wearing trousers. His chest was bare, and someone was bending over him, touching places here and there on his body with something that stung. Not bees, after all. He looked up with mildly wondering eyes and saw a face bending over him, a kindly bearded face, a face that he could trust. Not like that strange mask face of the Japanese. That other... He struggled on to his elbow, crying, No, I can't any more. I've had enough. He's mad, I tell you." A kind, rough voice said to him, "That's all right, my friend. That's all over. No harm done." My friend. That sounded good. He looked round him, and in the distance saw Dunbar. He broke into smiles, holding out his hand. "Dunbar, old man, that's fine. So you're all right?" Dunbar came over and sat on his bed, putting his arm round him. "All right, I should think so. So are we all. Even Jabez isn't much the worse. That devil missed his eyes, thank heaven. He'll have 2 scars to the end of his time to remind him, though." Harkness sat up. He knew now where he was, on a sofa in the hall with the tattered banners and the clock that coughed like a dog. He looked at the clock. Just 7:15. Only 3/4 of an hour since that awful knock on the door. Then he saw Hester. "Oh, thank God!" he whispered to himself. "Nunc dimittis." She came to him. The 3 sat together on the sofa, the bearded man, the doctor from the village under the cliff, Harkness afterwards found, standing back, looking at them, smiling. "Now tell me," Harkness said, looking at Dunbar, "the rest that I don't know." "Well, there isn't much to tell. We were only there another 10 minutes. When you fainted off, I felt a bit queer myself, but I just kept together, and then heard someone running up the stairs. I thought it was one of the Japs returning, but there was a great banging on the door, and then shouting in a good old Cornish accent. I called back that I was tied up in there, and that they must break in the door. That they did, and burst in. 2 fishermen and old Possitor, the policeman from Duntret. He's somewhere about the house now with 2 of the Trellis policemen. Well, it seems that a fellow, Jack Curtis, was going up the hill to his morning work in the Crepit fields above the wood here, when he heard a strange cry, and turning the corner of the road, finds on the path above the rocks Crispin, pretty smashed up, you know. He ran, only a yard or 2, to the Possitor's cottage. Possitor was having his breakfast and was up here in no time. They got into the house through a window, and saw the 2 Japanese clearing off up the back garden. Curtis chased them, but they beat him and vanished into the wood. They stopped 2 other men who were passing, and then came on Hester tied up in the library. She sent them to the tower. "Well, and then?" said Harkness. "There isn't much more, except this. They got up the doctor, had poor old Jabez's face looked to, and cleared him off down to his cottage. Were examining your cuts, all this down here. Suddenly a car comes up to the door, and in there bursts young Crispin. The 2 Trellis policemen had turned up 3 minutes earlier in their car, and were here alone except for Possitor examining Crispin Senior, who was pretty well smashed to pieces, I can tell you. Crispin Junior breaks through, gives one look at his father, shouts out some words that no one can understand, puts a revolver to his temple, and blows the top of his head off before anyone can stop him. Topples right over his father's body. The end of the house of Crispin. I saw all this from the staircase. I was just coming down after looking at you. I heard the shot, saw old Possitor jump back, and got down in time to help them clear it all up. No one knows where he'd been. To Truro, I imagine, looking for all of us. He must have cared for that madman, cared for him, or been hypnotized by him. I don't know. At least he didn't hesitate. And now, sir, would you mind telling me, said the stout, red-faced Trellis policeman, advancing towards them. 8. He was free. It was from the moment that the red-faced policeman, smiling upon him benevolently, had informed him that for the moment he had had from him all that he needed, his one burning and determined impulse to get away from that hall, that garden, that house, with the utmost possible urgency. He had not wished even to stay with Hester and Dunbar. He would see them later in the day, would see them, please God, many, many times in the years to come. What he wanted was to be alone, absolutely alone. The cuts on the upper part of his body were nothing. A little iodine would heal them soon. It seemed that there had come to him no physical harm, only an amazing, all-invading weariness. It was not like any weariness that he had ever known before. He imagined, he had had no positive experience, that it resembled the conditions of some happy, doped trance, some dream state in which the world was a vision and oneself a disembodied spirit. It was as though his body, stricken with an agony of weariness, was waiting for his descent, but his soul remained high in air, in a bell of crystal glass, beyond whose surface the colors of the world floated about him. He left them all, the doctor, the policeman, Dunbar, and Hester. He did not even stop at Jabez's cottage to inquire. That was for later. As 7:30 struck from the church tower below the hill, he flung the gate behind him, crossed the road, and struck off onto the downs above the sea. By a kind of second sight he knew exactly where he would go. There was a path that crossed the down that ran slipping into a little cove, across whose breast a stream trickled, then up on to the down again, pushing up over fields of corn, past the cottage gardens, up to the very gate of the hotel. It was all mapped in his mind in bright, clear-painted colors. The world was, indeed, as though it had only that morning been painted in green and blue and gold. While the fog hung under its canopy, the master artist had been at work. Now, from the shoulder of the down, a shimmer of mist tempered the splendor of the sky. Harkness could see it all. The long line of sea on whose blue surface 3 white sails hovered, the bend of the down where it turned to deeper green, the dip of the hill out of whose hollow the church spire, like a spear steel-tipped, gesticulated, the rising hill with the wood and the tall white tower, the green downs far to the right, where tiny sheep like flowers quivered in the early morning haze. All was peace. The rustling whisper of the sea, the breeze moving through the taller grasses, the hum of tiny insects, a lark singing, 2 dogs barking in rivalry, a scent of herb and salt and fashioned soil, all these things were peace. Harkness moved, a free man as he had never been in all his life as yet. He was his own master, and God's servant too. Life might be a dream, it seemed to him that it was, but it was a dream with a meaning, and the events of that night had given him the key. His egotism was gone. He wanted nothing for himself any more. He was and would always be himself, but also he had lost himself in the common life of man. He was himself because his contact with beauty was his own. Beauty belonged to all men in common, and it was through beauty that they came to God. But each man found beauty in his own way, and having found it, joined his portion of it to the common stock. He had been shy of man, and was shy no longer. He had been in love, was in love now, but had surrendered it. He had been afraid of physical pain, and was afraid no longer. He had looked his enemy in the eyes, and borne him no ill will. But he was conscious of none of these things, only of the freshness of the morning, of the scents that came to him from every side, and of this strange disembodied state, so that he seemed to float, like gossamer, on air. He went down the path to the little cove. He watched the ripple of water advance and retreat. The stream of fresh water that ran through it was crystal clear, and he bent down, made a cup with his hands, and drank. He could see the pebbles, brown and red and green, like jewels, and thin spires of green weed swaying to and fro. He buried his face in the water, letting it wash his eyes, his forehead, his nostrils, his mouth. He stood up and drank in the silence. The ripple of the sea was like the touch on his arm of a friend. He kneeled down and let the fine sand run, hot, through his fingers. And then he moved on. He climbed the hill. A flock of sheep passed him, huddling together, crying, nosing the hedge. The sun touched the outline of their fleece, too shining light. He cried out to the shepherd, "A fine morning!" "Aye, a beautiful morning!" "A nasty fog last night." "Aye, all cleared off now, though. It'll be a warm day." The dog, his tongue out, his eyes shining, ran barking hither and thither. They passed over the hill, the sheep like a cloud against the green. He pushed up, the breeze blowing more strongly now on his forehead. He reached the cottage gardens, and the smell of roses was once more thick in his nostrils. The chimneys were sending silver skeins of smoke into the blue air. Bacon smells and scent of fresh bread came to him. He was at the hotel gates. Oh, but he was weary now, weary and happy. He stumbled up the path, smelling the roses again, into the hall. The gong was ringing for breakfast. Children, crying out and laughing, raced down the stairs past him. He reached his room. He opened the door. How quiet it was, just as he had left it. Ah, there was the tree of the St. Giles, and there the grave, friendly eyes of Strang leaning over the etching table to greet him. Just as they were, but he not as he had been. He caught his face in the glass, smiling idiotically. He staggered to his bed, flung himself down, still smiling. His eyes closed. There floated up to him a face, a little white face crowned with red hair, but not evil now, not animal, friendly, lonely, asking for something. He smiled, promising something, lifted his hand. Then his hand fell, and he sank deep, deep, deep into happy, blissful slumber. End of Part 4, Section 2. End of A Portrait of a Man with Red Hair, a Romantic Macabre by Hugh Walpole.